and a very good Saturday to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to this week's video on hurricane season. It is now May 11th, 2024, and as you can see by the thumbnail card, we're definitely shifting a lot more towards hurricane season now, as we're potentially following what could be the first development of the season, potentially in the Eastern Pacific. Some of the models have hinted at that. Plus, we're going to go over new climate model data that has been released over the past week, obviously, as the new climate models have been coming out, and they've been giving all sorts of information that has just been pointing once again to what seems like a very active hurricane season incoming in the Atlantic. So we got all of that to go over this week. Glad to have you along. Let's get started. First off, the countdown till June 1st. We're now 21 days till June 1st when the Atlantic begins. However, this time I decided to include the countdown till May 15th because that is only 4 days from now. This upcoming week indeed will mark the beginning of the Eastern Pacific hurricane season. So this development that we're watching is indeed on par with the Eastern Pacific hurricane season starting, but also Atlantic tropical weather bulletins by the NHC will be beginning this week as well. So tracking basically for the hurricane season begins very soon, and hurricane season is very much on our doorstep. And since we're heading into the second 10-day period in May, I like to show these climatology maps that the NHC has. Kind of gives an idea of what to expect as we progress into each month. They have this for every single 10-day period from May all the way to November. So I guess we'll kind of take a look at this from time to time just to see, where we should expect development. And as you can see, from May 11th to May 20th, obviously we do have sometimes sporadic development that occurs in the Atlantic. But in the Eastern Pacific, if you remember last week when we showed this map from May 1st to May 10th, there was absolutely nothing in the Eastern Pacific. But now that we're in the May 11th to 20th period, we're now starting to incorporate the first few days of the Eastern Pacific season, and we start to see development occur out there. And it looks like we could have development very soon, but of course we'll touch upon that in a little bit. The NOAA Coral Reef Watch, though, let's take a look really quickly at sea surface temperature anomalies. And you could definitely see when it comes to the Eastern Pacific, very warm in the southern Eastern Pacific, especially closer to Central America. Temperatures running well above normal and definitely warm enough for development to occur if anything does try to get going. But we do see La Nina also beginning to solidify as well. And even this cold pool that we see off the Baja Peninsula, this is going to be a big implication for hurricane season this year, and it'll be very important, especially with an MDR that just seems to be getting warmer, very solid 2, even some 3 degrees Celsius kind of pixels in the eastern MDR. This area has warmed up dramatically over the last week, once again, as we had Saharan air clear out, and that allowed for the MDR to warm up. And look at the Gulf, too. Should have done a comparison to last week, but the Gulf is dramatically warmed up, and I'm actually going to show you actual sea surface temperatures. They're now beginning to reach the 26 degrees Celsius line, is actually beginning to reach right along the shelf waters of the northern Gulf. So it's very warm, and definitely we're starting to see that shift closer towards the summer now as we're heading into the depths of May, and before you know it, we'll be in June as well. Nino 3.4, though, really quickly just solidifying the fact that this La Nina is coming on. We're now down to only 0.3 Celsius in the Nino 3.4, meaning that we're no longer in El Nino territory. We've gone away from El Nino territory, and now you just see this continuous decline on our way towards La Nina. Pretty well known that this was going to happen, and it just continues that way. Meanwhile, in the MDR, up we go. Latest value at 1.3 Celsius right now in the MDR. It's even higher than the last peak was just a few weeks ago when we had MDR go all the way back down and then went all the way up again. And now we're going up even further, back at 1.3 Celsius on average across the entire MDR. And there's really no way we're going to turn this around. It's May 11th. The Eastern Pacific season begins this upcoming week, and the Atlantic begins in just 2.5 to 3 weeks from now. Exactly 3 weeks, since we're 21 days. So exactly 3 weeks from now, the Atlantic begins. And if we still get sea surface temperature anomalies like this, 1.3 Celsius averaged across the entire MDR, definitely no way I could see things dramatically changing to the Atlantic suddenly cooling rapidly over the next 3 weeks. It's going to take a lot longer than that, especially with warmth like this that we've seen persistent since the beginning of the year. So there's no other way around it. It is basically for certain that we're headed towards a pretty active hurricane season this year. And then, as I did mention before, the MDR really warming up, but also the Gulf Coast. You can see this is the current actual sea surface temperature map. This is by Tropical Tidbits. You can see Caribbean very warm. We even have some 29s and 30 Celsius readings across the Caribbean, so mid to upper 80s. If anything, boy, if anything really was going to develop in the Caribbean right now, it certainly has all of the ample warmth in order to do so. But the Gulf too, look at this. 28's beginning to show up in the Gulf, especially the Central Gulf. This is roughly associated with the loop current, but even then, in the Bay of Campeche, that's also begun to warm up a lot. 28's and 29's beginning to appear. And we're probably going to see this a lot more as we head into the latter portions of this month and into next month, when we start to see the Bermuda High really build in and help warm things up dramatically as we head towards a more summer pattern in the southeast. We're going to see all of these 26 begin to fill up the entire Gulf Coast, but it's already beginning to do so. And just go back to the sea surface temperature anomaly map, well above normal readings along the northern Gulf Coast, and you could see in response to that, you could see that we're starting to see 26s, patches of 26 readings beginning to make their way towards the shelf water of the Gulf Coast, and it looks like even warmer as we go right up against the coast. But it is shelf water, and keep that in mind that these shelf waters along the northern Gulf Coast are pretty easily mixed and stirred and dramatically changing in their readings as well. So that could also be kind of the reason why we're seeing the dramatic warm-up occur, especially along the northern Gulf, but certainly marks the sign in the shift towards the summer and as well towards hurricane season 2. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Pacific, though, as I mentioned, warm water is very ample there, 30, even widespread 31s in the Eastern Pacific too. And this area is actually where we are monitoring potential for development, and I actually show that on the GFS. You can see there, hour 150. The GFS does indeed have development there, but right around this region, the GFS and even some other models too have recently picked up on something getting going in the upcoming week, and we'll actually take a look at it right now. This is the 850 millibar vorticity by the GFS. Nothing really getting going yet right now in the GFS, at least for the next 2 days, but right as we head towards the time frame of the 15th, you kind of see vorticity starting to gather just south of Mexico, kind of gets going. But keep in mind, the GFS does kind of have a little bit of a bias when it comes to these sort of spin ups, so they kind of have lots of vorticity areas trying to consolidate. But GFS is trying to show something get going, hour 126. You could see vorticity areas, these isobars beginning to close off, so that kind of shows there is some sort of low pressure that is trying to consolidate. And look at that, by hour 150. GFS kind of has, once again, an issue with the convective feedback, that it kind of tries to spin up a lot of vorticity. Any sort of small area of vorticity it can latch onto, it tries to close it off and make it become a potent system. But the bottom line is that the GFS is showing something, and you can even see right as we head towards hour 168, something really does consolidate in the Eastern Pacific, and eventually with time it does begin to move off towards the east. And let's take it out to hour 240 just so you can see very, very intense system that the GFS is showing. And this is all part of an area of potentially more favorable atmospheric conditions that is beginning to move into the Pacific, and probably soon into the Atlantic as well. A convectively coupled Kelvin wave, I think, is what it is. A small, quick area of rising air that's going to move into the Pacific. And the GFS, because of that, is not the only model that is hinting at this. The CMC, the Canadian model, is as well. By hour 152, you can see they have an area of vorticity closing off just south of Mexico. And GFS is a little different with this. It kind of has two areas, a convective feedback issue, but I think the bottom line that we need to notice is that they do indeed, one, they do have systems. Both of the models do have systems. They have something. And two, they actually both have something strengthening. And it looks like, at least per the CMC, let's stop it at hour 168. It does get decently close to Mexico, although both models do take it outward as well. And as I did mention before, it is part of an area that is more favorable. And you can see right now in the Eastern Pacific, I guess its origins does come from this kind of area of stretch vorticity that is there. I definitely know that the formation of this that the models are hinting at comes from some sort of monsoon trough associated with the ITCZ, and then it breaks down, and then because of that, the models have something trying to consolidate and become our first system. That's kind of how these first Eastern Pacific storms usually end up forming, and also kind of why, if we look back at the GFS, they have this kind of mess or some sort of, stupid kind of fantasy, stranger things, we should say, that the GFS kind of shows, is because you could see right around hour 102. I'll actually back this up to, there we go, hour 96. You could see lots of vorticity within this area of the Eastern Pacific. It is associated with the ITCZ in the Pacific, and then as it begins to break down, you can see then the GFS tries to latch on to areas of vorticity that will try to close off, and then because of that, they end up forming systems. And you can kind of see why the GFS is weird, because they have one thing that forms near Mexico, then it kind of dies out and gets absorbed into this other big system. I mean, it's just a big mess that the GFS has, but the bottom line is that there is something there, and then obviously the other models have it too, and it does look like it'll come from something within the ITCZ that gets going sometime next week. In the Atlantic, though, right now, not much going on with vorticity. Still have yet to see our first tropical wave. Again, a lot of Saharan air out there, which has been clearing out over the last few days, but Saharan air right now can kind of keep a lid on things, especially when it comes to solid tropical waves that get going. But watch, once again, we'll revisit this in a couple of days to see if maybe something does indeed pop up in terms of vorticity in the MDR. Obviously will not form. It's only May, and as we head into June, although maybe we might have to watch for something getting going in the MDR next month. But yet we have still yet to see our first tropical wave. But watch in the next few weeks, a lot more greens will start to fill this region of the Atlantic as we get tropical waves going, and maybe a few of them as we head into next month and into July as well. Maybe a few of them will try to get going at some point. Can't really say right now, though, since we don't have anything going on yet. But as I did mention, though, if we look at the MJO, the velocity potential, all of this is happening within an area of which the MJO is moving into the part of the world that the Eastern Pacific is, especially the eastern half of the Pacific. If you look right now where we are in the time scale on this model, this black line represents the present day where we are right now, and look at that compared to the Eastern Pacific, and you see that we have these greens. And so that represents rising motion. That is what velocity potential is. It's rising motion in the upper atmosphere. And when we have that, obviously that means conditions are more favorable for something to get going in the Pacific. And as a response to that, we have models trying to get something going as well. So it does all kind of line up. It does fall into place too. And then you can see over the next several days as we head towards midweek, this area does kind of move into the Atlantic, and then moves on west, and then we kind of see as well beyond that, even into early June too, you can see this MJO rising area begins to come back into the Eastern Pacific, especially in the Atlantic, though, this time. And I've seen people mention that maybe we could be watching something for early June in the Atlantic too. But the bottom line I'm trying to point out is that we do have rising motion making its way into the Western Hemisphere, especially in the Eastern Pacific. And with that, models are seeing the potential that something could take advantage of it and maybe use those conditions to try to spin up something, which will be our first storm, potentially for the Eastern Pacifics this season. Lots of certainty still, though. The models are going back and forth between whether or not they even want something to develop in the Eastern Pacific. The Canadian model, last run with the 0Z, showed absolutely nothing. But the model run I showed you this time, let's go back to it really quickly. The 12Z, you can see here, hour 174. They have something there in the Eastern Pacific, and that actually looks like a pretty potent system. But if we go back to the 0Z run, they had absolutely nothing. So there's still a lot of uncertainty right now. And this is still kind of within a somewhat far out time frame. This is only around days 5 to 7 when this does look like it will be beginning to form or try to get going. But it is still within the next week or so that the models do hint at it. So just laying it out there, looks like we could potentially be looking at something getting going in the Pacific. We'll see, though, over the next week if that does indeed actually happen or not. Before I want to close out, though, as I did mention, climate models are out for this season. For the May, the rest of the models, I should say, came out. The European, the NMME, you name it, they all came out this week. But really specifically, I wanted to bring up a Ben Knoll tweet that I found very interesting, where he brings up the European precipitation for May, compared this May for 2024 for the heart of the season, compared with 2020. And he mentions really quickly, what we probably all know, that the 2020 season did go on to become the most active hurricane season on record. And this is what they show from this year in comparison to 2020. So this is 2024, very active look, lots of precipitation across the MDR and the Caribbean. But then we compare it to 2020, very stark difference. One thing I found very interesting, and I will point out that around this time, this was roughly around early 2020, the European did have a tendency to be very biased towards a drier Atlantic, mainly because they had a bias towards El Nino and very, how do I say it, a lot of sinking air in the Atlantic. The European used to have a bias with this, and I guess over the last few years they kind of corrected away from it. But it's very interesting and a little concerning, if you ask me, that the European for 2020 had dry conditions in the MDR. Really nothing just look at the two. It's night and day, really. Dry across most of the MDR and the Caribbean, while as opposed to this year for the peak season, it is completely opposite. All sorts of wet, all sorts of indications for lots of rising air, and potentially what seems like probably very strong tropical waves, and potentially a lot of them getting going and becoming systems in the Atlantic this year. Just a very overall different look than what the European had in 2020. And once again, the fact that 2020, with this look in the European, ended up becoming the most active hurricane season on record. Not that it really says that much about this year. Once again, given I did mention the European did have a little bit of a bias back then, but it's just very interesting indeed, and it certainly does raise questions. And Ben Knoll does have another tweet that I want to mention. He also mentions the velocity potential for this year. Looks like it could be very favorable too, especially noted by all that rising motion off of Africa and in the Atlantic as well, which obviously favors a stronger African monsoon. And in general, it just kind of lines up with the pattern of a really active hurricane season. You can see this is for July. Let me stop it at September. There, lots of rising motion over Africa, sinking as well in the Pacific, which is a sign of La Nina. Very favorable atmospheric conditions setting up as well. And then also he mentions too, we may have the first opportunity for our first tropical development in the basin, coinciding with the season starting around June 1st. And he mentions that because he brings up the JMA velocity potential, and you could see from the first week of June, we have rising air, at least on the JMA in the Atlantic, and obviously the Atlantic begins in early June. So you can kind of put the two and two together to assume that things could be very favorable. This is the one that I wanted to show you by Ben Knoll, the European UK Met Super Blend for this year. And it basically just goes to show the same thing. So this is not just the European, but this includes the UK Met as well. And you can see very, very wet across the Atlantic, dry in the Pacific too, which is associated with La Nina. Generally, the European showing very favorable conditions in the Atlantic too, even when combined with the UK Met. So it kind of just goes to show the consensus that all the models have in a very active season. And really quickly, before we finally close it off for this week, I want to point out Eric Webb too. Also drawing comparisons to 2020. He says with the C3S model, which is basically like the C3S and the NMME, which are basically they're the same. They're kind of like multi-model. They're multi-model ensembles, um, basically averaged to show one model, which basically how do I phrase it correctly? It is a multi-model ensemble, to basically show the picture of what all the models have, and that's what the C3S and the NMME are. And he says it is a near repeat of 2020 this summer with a warm, wet tropical Atlantic, La Nina, strong Indian monsoon, and an anemic and very anemic southwest United States monsoon as well. I guess that kind of ties into La Nina, which is why they have that. But he points out very strong Indian monsoon, very importantly, very wet Atlantic, which also the Atlantic is very warm as well. So basically what I think he's trying to point out, Eric Webb is trying to point out that conditions are very favorable in the Atlantic, and they're aligning up with 2020, a very infamous season that we've had just within the last several years. And it looks like they could be playing out in a very similar way to this year. And it's very important because 2020 was a record active season, at least when it comes to named storms and statistics that measure pure activity in the Atlantic. And the fact we're seeing a lot of those conditions replicated this year, and to some degree, they're even more advanced to 2020, especially when you look at MDR SSTs well ahead of 2020, and we're having very similar atmospheric conditions set up as well. It just all aligns that this year could be a very active hurricane season. And now that it is basically on our doorstep, it is just a wait and see to see. It is just a wait and see to kind of see how it all plays out and see whether or not this season will really be as active as everybody is thinking that it could be. Because we are, once again, May 11th. This upcoming week is May 15th. And the Eastern Pacific season starts. So that means that this is the last week. This video is indeed the last video that we're going to be doing when it comes to only weekly updates that I do. That I've been doing since the end of last season. I've been doing these weekly updates. We're going to end that this week as we head into May 15th. We're going to start with, hopefully, more regular daily video updates on what's going on, not just in the Atlantic, but the Eastern Pacific as well, and kind of just get into the groove of tracking and seeing what plays out this season. Definitely looks like, though, we'll have a lot in store to talk about. That's going to wrap it up for this week, though. Hope you guys all enjoyed it. Stay safe. Peace, love, and kindness to all. And we'll talk again this upcoming week and probably almost every single day after that.